I am joined by Bryan Gottlieb, former pro Magic player, current designer for LSS, the lead game designer for Flesh and Blood, which gives me a bit of an extra challenge on Guess the Cards because this is a guy who designs cards for a living. I feel like I need to give him some difficult ones, especially since he's already played Marvel Snap before. Marvel Snap is a game that he played until about Jeff came out, which means I have to pick the trickiest new cards to throw at him. Bryan, welcome to the show. What's your full history with Marvel Snap?
Yeah, so I played Marvel Snap in beta.
Mm-hmm.
Was there, very early on. Very impressed by the core design, core mechanics of the game. It's something I enjoyed, you know, playing pretty regularly every day. I would say played up to what do we call the top status in Marvel Snap? It's been so long I can't even remember.
Infinite.
Is it Infinite? Played up to Infinite once or twice, and then just reached a point where like the level of investment, like actual dollars and time the game was asking me for was not something I was really comfortable keeping up with anymore. It didn't really fit with like how I wanted to engage with the game. Like I wanted to engage with the game at the top level. I wanted to be building decks, exploring stuff, but I did not want to play 8 hours a day, and I didn't want to spend thousands of dollars. And Marvel Snap was a difficult game for me to engage with under those kind of limitations. So I left. I don't play anymore,
Yeah.
and I haven't really kept up with anything since I left.
Right. I felt like this was especially a challenge for me because you already knew A, how Marvel Snap worked, and B, you are literally a card game designer, whereas most of the normal people I have on here, God love them, they're great card game players, but I mean you as a card game designer probably know just how off base high level players can be when it comes to like identifying and fixing a problem. I've heard that players are very good at identifying a problem, but not very good at fixing it, which means I'm worried that you might be too good at this game, is what I'm getting at here.
I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think there is just so much room for interpretation, and also just goals among designers are very different. Like I actually think I have almost no qualms with the way Marvel Snap, at least in my time playing, designs their cards and the goals they kind of put out there. And like the clearest example I could give for this in my time was something like Zabu. When Zabu came out, it was at its release level. I was like, this card is clearly broken. It
Mm-hmm.
can't exist in this way for any extended period of time. But I don't think it was ever their intention to let it exist in that fashion for an extended period of time. It was just supposed to be like a juice new card. And I think that is often their approach is to just go ahead and juice
Interesting.
things. So when that is their approach, the heuristics you might use for like, is this card balanced? Is this card good? Uh, Sometimes they don't matter. Like I'm not sure that's always their goal is to make the most balanced card.
I think it is mostly their goal, but I think they have demonstrated a willingness to miss high because of the frequency with which they can patch stuff. That they're just like, I'm totally cool with missing high, and that's not a
Yeah.
situation that any other dev is in, right? Because if another dev miss high, you play a paper game. If you miss high, it's like, oh god, what
Yes.
have we done?
Yes. They have a ton of flexibility. And also, I think missing high tends to generate them dollars from whales.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a nice place to be. So, yeah, I would miss high a lot too in their position.
All right, so that actually is a good segue into our first card. This is Daken. He is a 3/4. On reveal, add the Muramasa shard to your hand, and the Muramasa shard is this thing right here, which is a 1/1. When it is discarded or destroyed, you double the power of Daken.
Yeah. So what is the exact analysis you would like from me here? Do you want me to let you know whether I think this is a powerful card, whether I
Yeah,
think this is a interesting card? What's like
powerful. I
the
want you to
real?
tell me
Okay,
how strong you think these cards are. Like that's
this
the game here is
great.
you tell me how strong the card is based on as little information as possible.
Yeah, so the main piece of information I will seize on in this case is the word double. And when we use doubling in game design, it always carries risk with it just because there's so many ways to sort of go parabolic with it, right? You can go ahead and double multiple times. You can find ways to sort of cheat before you double and buff the base power ahead of that. So just seeing the word double, my alarm bells are already ringing. This card strikes me as probably very strong.
So double, it's interesting that you flagged that, right? Because you can't, there's not really a good way in Marvel Snap. You can do it. It's pretty rare, right? Like, it's hard to get multiple Dakens as a reliable thing. And when you do get multiple Dakens as a reliable thing, the counterplay, you remember Shang-Chi, of course,
Yes, I
is
do.
so
Yep.
strong that over investing in it as it's required means that you actually tend not to do that, which means this guy is mostly played as like a 3/8 some of the time because the 3/8 is below the Shang-Chi threshold. But he is actually, I would say you're probably a little off base. This is not a very strong card. It's like a role player in discard and destroy decks. And it's a card that is like it's fine to good, but it's definitely not like make or break for either of those archetypes. I would say there are far more important cards in basically all of those archetypes. And so the interesting thing about this guy, I think, highlights the way Marvel Snap's meta develops, which is if you hyper invest in having something big, it is very easy to counter you having something big. And so this guy tends to not be worth investing in to make him go like, parabolic because he'll die to a Shang-Chi and you have to win 2 out of 3 lanes, right? And as opposed to just playing him as a 3/8 and being like, this guy's slightly above the curve now, right? Like that's his major use case.
Interesting. That makes sense given like the limitations on a format. I would still suspect that this card has a lot of latent potential for
Interesting.
specific scenarios. Again, just whenever you put those words on a card, you're sort of like as a designer, you like predictable caps and predictable ceilings, and maybe like you said, it ultimately doesn't matter what the ceiling is on a card like Daken because Shang-Chi exists, and that's actually the ceiling. Like the number is not the ceiling; it's that there is this built-in limitation
Yes.
as the ceiling, and that's quite interesting. And it does speak a lot to like how Marvel Snap is very different than traditional card game metrics. Like it is just able to escape some of those traps. I think in large part, like in greater part than anything else, due to deck size. Like that small deck where you're just going to see these effects in the vast majority of games. It becomes a very predictable dance, and I think that's something that I will have to remember,
Yeah.
having now disassociated from Marvel Snap for so long, as I go forward with my analysis of these
Well,
cards.
it's also the 2 out of 3, right? You hyper invest in this guy, you spend multiple turns making him enormous, and it's like, okay, you won 1 lane, congratulations.
Yeah,
How are you going to convert
that's
that
not the
over?
end.
Yeah,
Sure enough.
and so like in a normal game, the double is like there's only 1 lane to win in like Magic, for example, right? And so the double ends
What
up
if you're
holding
playing
down
Artifact,
everything.
KM? What if you're playing Artifact and you're one of the 3 people in the world who still play that game? A lot of lanes there.
I never played it, so I'm definitely not one of
You
the
didn't
three
miss
people
anything.
remaining. This is Silk. 2 cost, 5 power. Whenever any card is played here, they capitalized any, just so you'd know it was your cards and your opponent's cards. She moves to another location.
Okay, here's the thing I am missing about this card that I just can't remember because it's been too long.
Okay.
2/5 generally above curve. Is that fair to say?
Significantly.
Yeah.
The vanilla 2 is a 2/3.
Yeah. Huh. This is really interesting. So like there were periods of Marvel Snap where it seemed like numbers were actually what mattered way more than anything else. Like all you actually cared about was like how do I produce the most numbers on my side, and that is enough. And if I have access to enough numbers, I can play in such a way strategically where I can make 2 out of 3 lanes come out in my favor the vast majority of the time. In those worlds, this card just still seems very, very good to me. Like add in the fact that this can steal weirdo lanes, none of which I remember the names of, but things like where you can't play cards.
Yeah.
And it just seems like there's a lot of utility here for this to still be above rate. And yes, the predictability may not be there, but I feel like if you can just build your deck around numbers, this card should be predictably great and just spreading numbers all across the field.
I think it's like that's an accurate analysis in the aggregate, but a little less accurate in the current reality, which is this card actually tends to only be really great when you're playing it alongside like move synergy. This is not like a generic put this card in your
Hmm.
deck card, but like you play it alongside something like Craven, and like then suddenly your Craven is also scaling up whenever she goes back to him and then she leaves. That's like the that partnership tends to be the cornerstone of when she's actually really good. I think she's, yes, she is above curve, but the unpredictability is real. The fact that your opponent has control over it is real. The fact that the way priority works in Marvel Snap, if you have priority, your opponent gets to say, all right, well, she's definitely not going to be on lane X, is a little bit worrying, especially because her numbers are so good that you tend to have priority just a little bit more when you play her
Hmm.
because she's a big body. And so for the most part, like I will say, this is a card that I have considered among the best in the game before, but that has not been true for a very long time. And her viability tends to be as part of a package rather than as a standalone unit.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's hard because like I think again another huge challenge I'm going to have, not only reframing the way I think about cards in general, but uh, just understanding where the state of power creep in Marvel Snap is really challenging. Because
Yeah.
I'm going to want to fall back on like these ideas, and it is very clear to me that like, and even towards the end of my time with the game, like numbers stopped mattering a lot of the time. Like it was just way more about the most powerful thing you could possibly do, and that often was to present just absurd amounts of power. And a 2 for 5 played fair was never going to matter in some of those contexts. So as I see more cards, maybe I'll get a
Yeah.
better gauge of just like where the power level lies.
We've had fair metas where like a deck doing this and scaling up with Cravens and stuff has been the best deck in the game. That has existed. It just hasn't existed for a little bit now. Next up is X-23. You may remember this character from the movie Logan, actually. 1/2, when this is discarded or destroyed, regenerated at a random location, and you get +1 energy this turn.
Okay, +1 energy. Uh, that was kind of like my thing when I was playing Marvel Snap. It was where I felt like there was a lot of edge. It's just ramp strategies. I played a lot of ramp and doing multiple things above curve did again for a period feel like it could outscale most of what your opponents could do. The fact that like this replaces itself when you do those things can trigger any sort of discarding, destroying type effects seems very positive to me. Again, staying on curve, I believe, for the most part, which is like mostly fine. It's hard for me to think this card would be bad. Like it just seems like very good filler for the type of decks that want it. And like maybe I just need a dog, like an absolute garbage card to kind of reset my expectations, because this card seems at least fine, if not just like foundational to these discard destroy archetypes.
This is a foundational card in Destroy. It took Deadpool Destroy from a joke deck to a deck that has been a meta deck ever since this card came out. Like this is a major juicer to the Destroy archetype, and actually like the power level of this card is tends to be like, all right, this is what I actually wanted every new card to be, where it's like a very specific use case, but it's very strong in that use case, and it enables a deck that is like a fan favorite, Deadpool, to be great. And actually, this is just a weird coincidence, but like I have asked 2 second dinner people what their favorite deck in the game was, and both of them came back with Deadpool, which I understand that's like, it's literally only two out of who knows how many. But I'm just saying, it's weird that it happened twice. Okay? It's weird that it happened twice. It,
I was a big Deadpool fan as well, so I understand it. It's again like the scaling doubling thing is very
yes.
cool, and it's what people often want to do.
Yeah, I mean, like this card is so good in Destroy though because you can just trigger it multiple times, right? You get ahead of curve
Sure.
multiple times, basically for free, and like she's not dying. Any power you invest in her is gonna stay on her. Like it's just a very, 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 very strong card.
Yeah, good. I got one. Let's see
And
if I
for the
can get any
record,
more.
I think you said like, oh, there's no stinkers in here. I think Daken. I think most people would call Daken a bit of a stinker. Just gonna
Okay,
just gonna be honest. I think most people would
fair
say
enough.
He's a bit of a stinker. Meet Kang the Conqueror. 5-0, but on reveal, the turn plays out, except you get to reset it. You get to travel back in time to before the turn happened.
Yep. Okay, so I am cheating here. I remember this card. So
Oh,
I
then
I
I'll
know
get
I
rid of it. Don't worry
identified.
about it.
Yeah, I know I identified Jeff as like my starting point, but I remember when
Okay.
this was the last card I remember releasing. I never played with it, but I remember like seeing discourse around it, and I remember it being absolutely messed up. So cheating.
Wait, you remember it being absolutely messed up?
Yes, I do. On release. So is this the release version, or is this like
No,
where the
it's the
card
same
sits now, or
card.
did it never change?
It's the same card.
Okay, so when this card came out, I felt like every deck immediately shifted to add it. Maybe I was like not playing enough to understand that those efforts ultimately failed. But to me, the discourse around this card was just like, oh, always play this card, and then you get to punish your opponent every time.
No,
Did
it's
that not
terrible.
materialize?
It's awful. Like
Interesting.
this is widely agreed upon to be like one of the worst cards in Marvel Snap. It's
Interesting.
very
So,
bad.
did you personally ever feel differently?
Yeah, I had a tournament like the day after it came out, and I was like, this card looks awesome, and I threw it in there, and I lost.
I bet you're the person I was thinking of when I saw people tweet about it, because
No,
I mean, there's
I,
not many people in the Marvel Snap community that I follow. You're probably one
I
of
was
the few.
very excited for the guy, and then when you actually play with him, one of the things you realize is he's just discarding a card for no reason a lot of the time. Like, he's not the world's worst card in Marvel Snap, but he's probably one of the worst investments in Marvel Snap in terms of getting your money's worth
Interesting.
for him.
Okay.
Like, you're gonna, like, he will draw cards, because like the thing we didn't know about Kang until he came out was, would you draw a card when you played him? Because if you drew a card when you played him every time, he'd be the best card in the game, I feel like that would be
Yep.
like a deck thinner, right? But you don't draw a card unless he was the card you top deck. It just resets you to the beginning of the turn, and you draw the same card you would have drawn otherwise, right? And so that's the actual reason I feel like why Kang sucks. And if they actually wanted to make him good, all they would have to do is like just make it so that whenever you played him, you drew a card. And I know that's like that is like
just
a
that,
big
right?
Ask,
That
right? Like,
little, that little ad.
Yeah, just do that when like card draw is so gated in this game. But like, yeah, no, like just make him a cycler. But that would make him like played everywhere and very annoying. And I think the other thing about Kang is people don't like him because he's so annoying to play against. Because like it's a game about fast turns, and it's like, well, okay, we're playing this fast game.
Thanks for again.
Like thanks for adding this annoyance into my life. But no, Kang is not a good card at all.
Interesting. So one of the things that I think actually speaks really well in Marvel Snap's favor is the fact that cards upon release do almost always generate interest, and they generate wrong takes as well. And what that means is like you aren't dealing with a solved game system. You have like ways to sort of break paradigms routinely, and that bodes very well for like being able to expand this game system over time. So your mistake, and by proxy my mistake, having observed your mistake from a distance with this card, says very good things about the health of Marvel Snap, I think.
I've never made mistakes in my life. All right. I don't know what you're talking about. I've never been wrong about any card evaluation I've ever done.
Then you haven't done enough card evaluations. And I'm telling you, man, embrace those mistakes and learn from them. That's what separates the great from the average when it comes to card game content. Owning your
proudly
mistakes.
Average. I'm average.
Awesome.
Okay, I'm average.
Awesome.
Next up, Werewolf by Night. 3/3. But every time you play an on reveal, it moves to the location you played the on reveal on, and it gets +2 power.
So if I were to play multiple on reveals on the course of my turn, would this move to each spot and gain +2 power each time?
It would.
Okay. My first impression of this card was pretty low, honestly. The idea that I could just, maybe play 3 on reveals on a turn, maybe combine that with move effects, starts to push it much higher. I don't think this card is good in a vacuum, is my guess. But with specifically move-based effects, it does seem like you could trigger this multiple times per turn, which is a little paradigm breaking. As I remember the move archetype, like you kind of just got like your 1 or 2 moves per turn, and only as like your big finishers could you get a huge swath of moves. It seems like maybe this card can sort of break that paradigm. So I expect a niche card, but maybe good in that niche.
So this card for the past, I would say, since it came out, basically, has been the best scaling threat in the game. Like, you remember the role Bishop had? This is Bishop
I,
plus.
I do
You
remember
would just
Bishop.
play, like, what you're missing here is that you don't play him in a move deck. You play him in a bounce deck where you just like play your little 1 cost on reveals, you send him back to your hand, then you
Mm,
play your little 1 cost on reveals, and then he's like a 320. And like that's the thing that he does very, very well. He is at this point, I would say, the premier early scaling threat. Like if you're looking for a Tarmogoyf, this is the guy. Like this is
yeah,
your
putting him in the Bishop role makes it like making that comparison makes it very clear that there is something here.
yes. Like the like Bishop is like a smaller that gets a smaller buff. And so if you just build your deck to be on reveals, this guy is like 2 bishops. He's very, 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 very big. And he uses that keyword big to be one of the most important cards in the game.
And I guess too, non-rotating card pool ever expanding since my time having left the game.
Yeah.
There's probably more quality on reveal cards than ever. Whereas I read that as a limitation at first. You probably have no trouble just finding 12 excellent on reveal cards to fill your deck.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much it, right? Like there it is a context dependent card. It's just like I think you could probably do it even with the cards that were around when you were there, right? Like you just get
Maybe,
stuff.
yeah.
You do like you like Iceman, Korg, Black Widow, Beast, Falcon. That's like 5. You pick 2 more on reveals that cost 1, and you just go to town. Like I think you could probably. I think you could probably make it even with cards that were there when you last played this game. It would
Seems
still be
pretty
good.
reasonable. Yep.
This is Martyr. She is Captain Marvel in reverse, but in exchange, she is a 1/4. Reasonably large body for the cost. What do you think of Martyr?
This is a really smart card. It
Really?
seems I think like very well designed in
Hmm.
terms of like what it's asking and like what it makes me think about. However, it seems very hard for this card to be good. Like if this is good, wouldn't just almost anything else also have been good in her spot? And 1/4 doesn't feel that far above the curve where like I want this end game certainty. This feels like a I would say absolute stinker to me, but I am so gun shy at this point that I'm expecting to just be completely blown out and hear about how this is the best card in the game.
No, it's an absolute stinker. It's
Okay.
very, very bad.
Okay.
Yeah, this is not a good card. It's a card that I bought specifically for these videos and so far have only used in these videos. Like
Excellent.
she exists to elicit reactions for these videos. That's her best role is content farming, right? Just like show her to
Awesome.
someone who's gotten a couple wrong and then be like, "All right, what about this one?"
Yeah. Punish them for their uncertainty. But I
Yes.
saw through your ploy, and I
Mhm.
still think this is a beautifully designed card. It does something really cool. But yeah, it's hard to think of a scenario where this is better than doing anything else in the game.
Yeah, that's pretty much it, right? Like it's like, oh, you get 1 extra power in exchange for the worst card text imaginable. Maybe you
Yep.
call it 2 extra power, but it's like, okay, this is actually terrible. Now the second part of this question is what would her stat line have to be for her to be good?
Yeah, so context dependent, but I do think like if you push this card really hard, then it becomes pretty interesting. The problem I see though, if you push to like 1/6, then shouldn't you just like play zoo, fill every single spot on the board, and then you just shut off the lose mechanic, and then it actually probably becomes like both good and completely uninteresting. So the card sort of fails at that break point. You need it to have this weird quasi tension where it's sort of good but also not good. And then when you introduce that quasi tension, I think the card is just going to fail a lot. So it's possible this is an unfixable card actually, and you
Yeah.
can't make this good and
Yes.
still make it like interesting.
You know, that's exactly correct. Because, like, I was going to relay a story about how she was a 1/6 in testing, but what they realized was when she was a 1/6, her effectus wouldn't happen. Because
Yep.
she'd win whatever lane that it is, regardless, right? Like, there wasn't a lot of ways for her to actually be bad. And that's the thing about this card is if you introduce ways for her to be good, what you do is you make her text not happen. But because her text says lose the game if it happens, no one will play her if her text happens. And so
Correct.
yes, you're the first person to ever get to exactly that, which is like this card is actually, I think, kind of unfixable. It has to be bad in order to be a card, because otherwise, what's the point of its text?
And that brings up like a really interesting question. And one of the things that is intriguing about Marvel Snap as it continues to exist and continues to grow, or whatever it is that it's doing right now, I honestly have no idea. But how often are you going to commit resources to making cards like this? Because my first response to this card is that this card is cool. This card is awesome. I am happy I got to see this card and I'm happy it exists. But it's unfixable and it can't ever do anything. So like, are you willing to commit design space to that type of stuff? And often in like paper card games, you are willing to commit that design space. It's really cool to tell those stories sometimes, and it adds to the flavor. And I'm not gonna pretend like I know Martyr from the comics or any other media, but I suspect, given the name, this probably does a very good job telling a flavorful story about what it is she does. So it's very interesting. But again, like when I left Snap, some of it was economic models, and it's really hard to see this card fit in under any of the economic models that I've ever seen Snap deploy. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I do wonder about that a lot, because Marvel Snap is a game. It's like one card a week, right? And if that card's not exciting, it's like I find it hard to believe it's possible to avoid power creep under that scenario, right? Because it's like, well, you want people to be excited about your cards, and the easiest way to make people excited about your cards is make them good.
make
And
them
I
good. Yep.
appreciate that they're still willing to just be like, no, here is just like a card that fits the character. Like, this is just a card that it's like, we did not make this thinking about top level play. We made this to just make you think about how you could make this downside not bad.
Yeah, and I think that's like, it's so important when you think about who the market is for this game. And it's a little different with a card again like Martyr. I don't expect there's a ton of Martyr fans out there, but like when you're making your Spider-Man card, you have to make that card feel like Spider-Man. And it is one of the things that always felt hit or miss to me. I think the highs of making flavorful Marvel Snap cards were really, really high, and the lows were just kind of, I get what you were going for, but it didn't quite get there. But this one I would put in the very, very high camp, like a really nice job of just capturing some flavor.
You would consider Spider-Man one of those lows, right?
I would consider Spider-Man on the low side, in part because of power level, in part because of the mechanics, and then something like Galactus very much on the high side, or even Thanos like very much on the high side of flavor, where it just is, yes, this is what this character does, fits perfectly. And maybe just like the stakes of Spider-Man were too small for my sensibilities. But it's weird because Spider-Man is kind of like a lower stakes hero. He's not galaxy defining, but at the same time, he is the hallmark hero of the Marvel universe. So it kind of puts you in a tough position, I guess.
I didn't plan on doing this, but this is new Spider-Man. He actually got nerfed because his old ability was too good and too annoying.
Okay.
So like, for you remember, I believe 4/3 Spider-Man that would restrict your opponent's lanes.
Correct.
Right?
And it was very good. Like I
Okay.
remember that card being very good. Like
Okay.
I it's not about power output. It is about, this feels too small stakes for a hero like Spider-Man to really capture the
Gotcha.
vibes to me.
So we're going to take a digression here. First of all, this is new Spider-Man. Tell me how good he is. Second, tell me if you think this is a better design, because when they redesigned it, they mentioned a lot of the same things you did.
I think from a flavor perspective, this feels way better to me. Like I feel the webs when I'm looking at this, and this is a lot more pew pew web shooter bullshit in my eyes. Whether it's good, this certainly seems worse. And then, how does the mechanic work? Like, do I choose an enemy card, or is it just a random enemy card at the location?
It's random. They actually just changed it, so now it's only face-up cards.
Interesting. And obviously, I don't get to choose the move either from this
No.
Spider-Man. Yeah, it feels like at that point it probably has metagame uses, but is a bit like more narrow. I can see scenarios where it is very, very backbreaking and kind of like foils your opponent's plans that they very carefully crafted. And then I can see other scenarios where it's like this is an almost random effect that can have uh, as negative of a bearing on your outcome towards the game as a positive one. So I think my call would be meta dependent on this new effect.
I mean, that's like basically right. It's just the thing that you're missing is that, like, it's still a 3/5, right? Like, yeah, it could be like the effect could be good or bad, but it's still just like a good body for the cost. So it ends up
Yep.
seeing a little more play than you might think, I would say. Like, the disruption is, I think, an underrated part of the card, and most of the decks that play it just play it for either a move trigger, being 3 cost, being 5 power, or just like and like the disruption is like, there are going to be some situations in which this card is actually really helping me, like I'm moving too
Cool.
early scaling threats to the same lane or whatever, right? Like the analogy I would use is like, what if I put your bishop in your Angela lane, right? If I had like a 50%
Hmm.
chance to do that, you'd be in a really bad spot. Not that anyone is particularly doing that right now, but I'm using boomer analogies here just to
Yeah, yeah.
get the
No,
point.
I get it. I'm sure there is some, likewise combination of
Yeah.
heroes that can be similarly disrupted. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. This is Loki. 4 cost, 5 power. He copies all the cards in your opponent's starting deck, or as many of them as you can fit in your hand. The amount of those cards, of course, being dependent on the number of cards you currently have in hand. He doesn't like fill your hand or anything. And then
Hmm.
he gives them -1 cost. Sorry, your face. You're just like, what is this?
Is it your opponent's starting deck? All right, just with sixes, this feels like this has the capacity to be completely busted. Then when I start thinking about like, oh, there's probably like ones and twos along the way that I'm picking up, and it just feels like your turns 5 and 6 after you play Loki are absurd. Like, how is your opponent supposed to counterplay around this? Are they supposed to play bad cards in their deck? Well, then their deck sucks, and you will just not play Loki and beat them. So I actually feel like I'm missing something with this card. Like 4/5 doesn't feel that bad in terms of stat lines. Again, just like the potential to hit a 6 on 5. I remember how impactful sixes are. And like you're drawing live to that. And you can like set up your early game so your cards in hand are high at the moment you play this. So you have a good potential to hit. This card just seems extremely, extremely strong to me.
You're the actual first person who's ever gotten that right. Like, you're the
Okay.
first person who's just looked at this card and been like, that's the best card they've ever made. And yeah, that's the best card they've ever made. That
Okay.
is, it is.
That checks out.
Would you believe it came out as a 3/5?
No, I would not, actually.
Okay, well, it
That
did.
seems
It did
absurd.
actually come out as a 3/5.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, but this is what I mean. Like, I do think occasionally they like to aim really freaking high, and I like that they did it on a character like Loki. And I pointed to the Zabu example earlier in our discussion, where like that card came out and was just facially and obviously absurd, and I thought it was a bit of a waste because I don't know who Zabu is, and as hot as Loki is within Marvel properties right now, I understand why they wanted to just absolutely juice this card. 3/5 seems wild, just absolutely wild to me.
Yeah.
And I suspect it's still probably the best card at 4/5. But
It's
yeah,
up there. Yeah.
I, I just think like that is often their approaches. They just want to make these really strong cards. This one though seems a bit more troubling than the average strong card because I don't know what you're supposed to do about this.
That tends to be the reaction from the community as well,
Okay.
right? Like, what do you do about the fact that they played Loki and they just do your deck better than you? And you talked about how like you have to play bad decks in order to counter it. There was a while,
Synergistic.
yeah, no,
maybe
but
it's a better way
you're
of putting
right.
it.
Like there was a while where people were like, "All right, how do we beat Loki? It's Hela and Cerebro 3." And it's like, no, don't like it. You'll beat Loki, but like then you have the problem of you're playing those decks, right?
Yeah.
And so what's eventually happened is like the way people have agreed upon is the way to beat Loki is early scaling threats that when Loki copies them do not scale as well for him. So we talked about
Okay.
the werewolf, right? It's pretty good
Yep.
against Loki, right? Like Loki is itself a werewolf deck currently. But like,
Right. I mean, like if he hits the
yes.
right cards though off your werewolf, it seems like he has the capacity to push the werewolf
Well,
harder
werewolf
than
is
maybe even you
gated by
can in those
board
last two
space,
turns.
right? So like it can
Yeah.
only go where it can move, and so you get a werewolf on turn 5, your board is pretty full at that point. When you're playing the Loki deck, your werewolf's going to be like a lot smaller than the opposing werewolf. But like generally that has been the way you do it. You attack it by like you play your early scaling threats, like your Angela, although she actually got nerfed. RIP baby. But Angela was like a great way to counter this, or not
I think
counter it, but
she
like
was nerfed like 3 times in my time with the game. So it's possible
yeah.
she's just still out there catching nerfs.
But yeah, no, like you'd play your early scaling threats, and then when Loki would get your early scaling threats, it would be like a little bit more of a fair fight. One of the things that I think is easy to miss about this card, and it's what I missed when I first evaluated it, is that like every deck in Marvel Snap kind of does the same thing. Like you have to go very hyper synergistic in order to give Loki a hand of actually bad cards, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that,
especially once you reduce the cost. Like
yes.
I do think it would be possible if the cost reduction was not there, you could make a bad synergistic hand. But just when everything is resource cheaper, it feels like even your like off curve synergies.
Yes.
So like you're playing a 3 and a 4 drop on turn 5. Well, yes, those cards aren't as synergistic anymore, but they're still a 3 and a 4 drop. And if they have any kind of interacting synergies with each other, you're probably coming out ahead of curve.
Right. This is why like people would do stuff like Hela, because like you just give them a handful of like a black cat that gets discarded, a Giganto they can't play, an Infinite they can't play. And like that's how you would handle like Loki in the early days. And then it gradually got a little bit more sophisticated with like realizing that hey, decks with early scaling threats can match up into this, and you could try to punish them in matchups where they don't have their Loki on time, things like that. Like I would say that at the time of recording, Loki, due to recent balance changes, is like hanging on by a thread at best in terms of like being generally regarded as the best deck. But he is probably by far the most hated archetype because people just don't like losing to their own stuff, and they don't like feeling like the game is over when you play a 4-drop.
I think the bigger problem to me, if just talking from like a game designer perspective, is that you create a game where you tell you tell your players like you can do anything you want, make your cool stuff happen, build your deck, do awesome stuff. If the best thing to do is take your opponent's deck, then you've taken away a lot of that creativity and you've kind of homogenized everything. And that is my biggest problem with this card from a design perspective. I'm sure it creates some cool moments, some cool combinations of cards that you don't typically see. But on the whole, I think there is something a bit off about the play experience this is asking me to engage with.
That's actually a really insightful statement. I feel like this whole episode has been like when I film these, I feel like the way I put them in my head is like they're like vaguely insightful comedy. But this one has just been like, oh, you're going to school. You're learning stuff. You're learning stuff today.
I try to be out there teaching, man. That's my mission. Is out there, maybe poorly teaching, but teaching anyway. Trying to get people to think about things the way I do.
No, you're the first person who's looked at Loki. We've had, I want to say, 6. You are the 6th guest on here, and you're the first person who's looked at Loki and been like, "That's insane. I can't believe they would do that." And I think other people have gotten it rightish, but you're the first one who's been like, "Well, that's ridiculous."
I will say my capacity to know they have it in their range to make an absolutely ridiculous card probably helps me feel a little safer just being like, yeah, this one might be one of those.
Yeah. Negasonic Teenage Warhead. 3/2, but after an enemy card is played here, destroy it. So she just gets to nuke whatever it is your opponent plays there once she's turned face up.
This is cool. I like this in terms of like what it brings to the table for Snap, this kind of back and forth interaction and removal, which is not something that, at least in my time, existed in this sense. It feels like this has capacity to steal some games. Like against specific plans where like your opponent is leading towards a specific 6 in a specific spot, this probably feels pretty backbreaking. But maybe it's a bit of a safe route I'm taking. But again, it feels niche in its application, and it's more about what my opponent is trying to do than like the base stats of this card and what this card itself accomplishes. Although I do like the broad scenario, even agnostic of the specific things an opponent is trying to do, of just like claiming a lane or at least forcing double card in a lane, which I think can be very interesting just in terms of like economics of how turn 6s are often played.
I think that's basically correct, right? Like she is a niche card who has very specific uses, but also, in my opinion, is just underrated as a general card, right? Like that is almost exactly how I would describe her right now, with full knowledge of the metagame and full knowledge of what she is and what she does, which is she's not like she's a card that I feel like if I release this video too late, I could look very stupid on, because I feel like at any time, like it could happen. You know what I mean? It could
To just become
happen.
the most important card.
Yes, I feel like at any time it could happen, but it hasn't yet, and so it would not be accurate to describe that as like an actual description of her. Just more something I think about in the back of my head sometimes. And right now, she is a very niche situational card.
Yeah, I really like it though. Like as a in terms of a card that exists that I'm happy to see as part of the game, it seems like a really smart place to take modes of interaction.
It took them a while to get here, because when she was originally released, she was a 3/4, except she would die too. And she
Mm,
was just terrible. And
yeah,
then they made her a 3/5, which is incredibly confusing, because like it ties back to the Martyr conversation, where it's like, well, if this card's effect matters, then it's a bad card, right? And so it's like, by the same token, making this card that dies stronger doesn't actually do anything to it. It just makes you want to not use it for the thing that it's for. And
yeah,
so then they were like, all right, no, we're reworking it entirely. Now she'll just blow up your opponent's card, but she's a 3/2. And that's where she is now.
yeah. That seems correct to me. You want to give good messaging. Like, what is this card supposed to do? And
Yeah.
power does not give good messaging.
That was a very confusing, like, I called it out at the time, where it's just like, I don't understand what they're doing, giving this extra power. It doesn't make any sense. It's not going to change anything. And it didn't. But yeah, no, I think this is an underutilized card that is accurately described as niche, but potentially powerful.
I will tell you just as a complete lark, a complete guess, that kind of buff speaks to me that they believed the card was already good, but they wanted to trick people into playing with it and exploring it more. That's my guess. And I just thinking about how I would do it. Like sometimes you just put a number on a card that makes it more attractive, and then that allows people to go ahead and reevaluate it. So
Interesting. Okay, that is a plausible explanation that I didn't think of at the time. Next up, we have Annihilus. 5 cost, 7 power. On reveal, everything you have with 0 or less goes to your opponent. Oh, and by the way, the ones that can't go to your opponent, they just die.
okay, I wonder if there have been more like Hobgoblin. I don't remember what the other minus card that
Green
existed when I was
Goblin.
playing Green Goblin. I wonder if there have been more of those since I stopped playing
There
because
are no
as
more
like
goblins.
okay, like interesting as potential sideboard ish tech for that type of setup. I know we don't get to play with sideboards here, but if that was a very meta focused or a very focal point of the meta game, maybe this card has some utility as far as that goes. And then I'm just trying to think of like, are there ways to neg yourself and then shift over to your opponent? And I don't know of any. This feels like it has two potential roles, either as that counterplay to those negging effects, or there is an archetype build around that I don't have the knowledge to go ahead and present whether this card is good. But again, cool. I like what it's trying to do. I guess too, you could like just have a bunch of crap like rocks and stuff that fill a portion of the field, and then you send those over and reset. Now that I think about that, that is actually more appealing to me I don't remember my rock effects well enough. I don't remember if like you rock yourself when you're making rocks or you just rock your opponents. So I feel like I'm just missing too much context to evaluate this card, but I understand what they're going for, and it makes me want to know what else is out there, which means it's probably like at least a good archetype enabler.
Correct. And it is I think best utilized in like small packages where you just like put the best things that you want to send over in your deck, like the things whose downsides are so high that you need to mitigate them with this. I don't know if you remember. I don't know if you were playing at the time. There's a card Sentry that's a 4/10 that makes a -10 on your board, and so
I don't
that
remember that one.
that goes with this guy for sure. But even just like the hood, right? Like taking
Yep.
up a board space, doing that. Like usually when I play with this guy, it's in the context of just like I have a deck and I put Sentry in the hood and this guy in it. Like that's
Okay.
how he tends to play out for me. There are people who invest more heavily in the rock stuff and doing all of that. But the interesting thing about this guy to me is he's sort of self-solving because if his deck ever gets popular enough, playing a mirror is just like, okay, who plays this guy last? Because
Yeah.
and there's also just like a ton that goes into him in terms of like, all right, well, I'll just fill up the location and that way at least I won't get the -10, right? Like at least that way I'm not getting completely dunked on here. And that's I think an interesting way to design what could be a very very powerful card by making it self-solving. And I think when you look at something like Loki, one of the major issues it has is rather than being self-solving, it's like self-parabolizing. It when you
Hmm.
copy your opponent's Loki, you do it more. Like you accelerate how dumb the game gets every time you do it.
Oh, at 3, that just must have been constant. Like you
It
just must
was.
have been the
It was
dumbest
everywhere.
possible
Right.
games.
Like it was
Yeah.
like Collector would have like 25 power because you just be
Yeah.
flipping through your hand every single turn and it would all be about who got their opponent's Loki. Like that's
Yep.
how it was in the first month he came out. After the nerfs and some sort of adaptations from the metagame, he became a little bit like right now, I think the way I would describe Loki, not how anyone else would describe him, but just my perspective, is that he has been like attached to other broken stat packages as an easy fit in those archetypes rather than necessarily carrying the deck himself. But at least in terms of like the previous build of the deck, he was the best fit with those like stat packages. In terms of the current build of the deck, I think it's arguable whether he's the best fit, but he's a very powerful card that's like a plan unto himself that's easy to just stick with a bunch of early scaling stats. And so that's why his issues are so prominent. Whereas this guy wants you to be doing something different and he's self-solving. So it's like if like I think of him as an example, like if you want to release a good card, this is a great model for how to
Mm.
do that, I think.
Yeah, and it is nice. Like one of the things I liked about Marvel Snap deck building when I was doing it was the ability to port those kind of small packages into different scenarios
Yep.
and different archetypes and see how they work. And as soon as you mentioned like this with a touch of Sentry and Hood, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like you just have a nice tight 3 card package that gets you a lot of advantage in a lot of spots. And
Yep.
I remember those being kind of littered throughout Marvel Snap during my time with it. And I think they're cool. I think it is kind of like how you slot uh, like maybe not slot archetypes, but at least create archetype churn. It does a really good job of like, oh, I'm going to move these packages around and see who can leverage them both leverage them best. And also just having access to the fact like, oh, this metagame is actually vulnerable to this package. So now I can move it into this deck. And then the metagame churns from that point. I think that's also very useful for the game.
Agree. And I think Annihilus currently is like a little bit of an underrated card. He was kind of a lot of places when he came out, and then like the novelty wore off and the mirrors were really terrible. And so I feel like he's the kind of card that basically at any point when the like if you can fit that 3 card package and stuff, he's very, very difficult to beat when his stuff actually works because like getting a -10 on your side of the board is just like, oh, I'm dead.
Backbreaking. Yeah.
Like, I've actually just died. I've lost that lane entirely because it's not like you can
Yep.
Shang-Chi it. It's just there. And there isn't exactly enough destroy in the metagame. And doing it late enough means that the destroy deck is already trying to execute its end game rather than like play carnages and venoms and deathlocks and stuff. And so it's just like, oh, wow, that's really, really annoying for basically every deck unless they are able to properly like fill up that lane.
Yeah, it wouldn't shock me if this card ever reaches the point where it needs a nerf, that it actually just gets moved down the curve. And I think like that may make it more interesting if it's doing its thing at 4 as opposed to
Really?
5, and open up things like counterplay. Yeah, you just like dramatically reduce its own power input, so that way it like isn't single-handedly changing lane math if you save it for late turns. So it's something like a 4-5, maybe even like 4-4, and then you just kind of lean into the effect and open it up earlier. I could see there being a little bit better game states coming off of this card.
Interesting, because like I feel like 4 is a very dangerous energy cost to give because Zabu exists, and so it's just like you suddenly end up in a scenario where like this can be one of several cards you play on the final turn of the game, and that
Okay, wait.
feels
What
bad.
what does Zabu do right
Current
now?
Zabu is a 2/2 that gives -1 to 4 costs.
Okay. That doesn't sound like the Zabu I remember. I don't remember what the Zabu I remember
The
did.
Zabu you remember was a 3/2 that gave -2 to 4 costs.
Okay.
But actually, no, like by the time you quit, this is the Zabu you remember. He hasn't been changed since. Let's talk about being judicious with your 4 costs. This is Miss Marvel 4/5. Adjacent locations where your cards have unique costs have +5 power.
Your cards have unique costs.
Oh, I should clarify. No cards is not a unique cost.
Okay. That is good to know. Output on this seems absolutely massive. I believe that +5 to your 2 side locations is just very, very hard to overcome. Again, 4 cost. Now I'm thinking about that in conjunction with Zabu. So I want to like smooth curve with this, which should not be hard in a Marvel Snap deck. It's very easy to have all unique costs. The only thing that is holding me back from saying this card is probably just absurd is the potential for an opponent to disrupt your unique costs. I don't know how hard it is for them to sort of insert a rock, whatever it is they have to do to sort of break up what you're doing. But I feel like this is not hard to achieve if you were building your deck around it. And I feel like the output is, I mean, 4 cost 15 is just completely bonkers. So I am leaning towards extremely, extremely good, with the caveat that if it is easy to disrupt, it is probably worse than I think it is.
It is extremely, extremely good. But the disruption you're talking about doesn't come from your opponents giving you stuff. It comes from like cards that blow up ongoings, right? Like it's not about like your opponent's turning off her effect on the side lanes. It's about your opponent's just like being like, actually, the thing you invested in is not happening anymore.
Turning
Or
her off, sure.
sometimes I'm gonna rogue it and now it's my Miss Marvel. Like that's the real counterplay this deck has to worry about, because like you're always putting her in the center and they always know that. And
Yep.
so you are very much able to deal with this card. It is a pretty commonly seen thing. It's like, oh, this card very easily able to be dealt with. It is.
Seems like though it would still have a place in the metagame, at least a metagame that refuses to punish it. Is that accurate? Where like if the metagame
Oh
doesn't
yeah, this
respect
card's
it,
awesome.
it's very easy for it to
This
come
card
in?
is ridiculous. Yeah. It's a very, 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 very powerful card. It is the most recent season pass card. I guess not the most recent now, but like the previous most recent season pass card. And it is extremely, extremely, extremely strong. Yes, 415 is a very, very good number. There's going to be some reading here. This is Nico Minoru. She has an on reveal that says, after you play your next card, cast a spell. The spell changes each turn. So each turn, she's going to have different text. She rotates through those texts in order. So, you know, not in order, but like once each time. So once you see a text, it's gone forever that game. It will be replaced with a different version of her. So these are the spells that she casts. After you play your next card, double this card's power. After you play your next card, add a copy of it to your hand. After you play your next card, replace that card's location. After you play your next card, give it +2 power. After you play your next card, move it 1 location to the right. After you play your next card, destroy it to draw 2 cards. After you play your next card, it becomes a demon, which is it's the thing from the hood, the 1/6.
Yep.
And you will never see the same spell twice. It will, in your hand, will continually rotate.
That was 6 different spells, is that correct?
That is correct.
Marvel Snap, as it was being played when I played it, was very much about predictability and sort of rehearsed playlines. I like this card for its potential to mess with that. However, I suspect that because of the unpredictability of this card, it is very, very hard for serious constructed decks to lean on it. Like the 6 effects sort of have separate enough stuff going on that I don't feel like you can get the effect you want out of this with any kind of regularity. You can't just like give up on your next play. You have to make your next play. And if it is something that negatively impacts how you want to make that next play, like I'll be honest, scrolling through those 6 effects very quickly, it's just too much for me to comprehend. Like I don't know how synergistic they can be with each other, how much they are ignorable in scenarios.
Do you want me to go through them again?
Yeah, we could do one more pass through.
Okay.
I'll take one more read.
She turns a card into a demon, making it a 1/6.
Yep.
She blows up your next card to draw 2. She moves a card to the right, the reverse of Iron Fist, actually. She gives your next card 2 power, Forge. She replaces your card's location, that's Scarlet Witch. She adds a copy of the next card to your hand, which I guess is Sentinel when you think about it, but not really.
Yeah.
After you play your next card, double this card's power. And she's a 1/2.
Yeah, like none of those are bad. Like I guess I can live with basically every single one except like destroy in scenarios where I'm playing towards a very specific thing. But they all do get much worse if I'm not playing this card on turn 1. Like if I draw this off curve. My final judgment is I expect this card sees some amount of play, but it's not like built around. It's not like optimized. It's just there's enough going on where if you have flexibility in your curve, particularly let's go with this decks that are comfortable not making a play on turn 2, I think can get more out of this card than any other deck, and maybe that's where it shines a little bit. But I'm just like kind of low on this card. I suspect its unpredictability makes it see less play than I would initially expect, given how flexible it is, and the fact that like baseline stats, I can get 1/4 pretty regularly out of this card. I just think the unpredictability though dooms this in some scenarios.
Clarifying question here. Are you evaluating this card as if you don't know what it's going to do when you play it?
No.
Okay, you can see the text, right? Okay.
Yes, I believe I can see the text, but I don't know which text I'm going to get on a given turn.
That is correct. That is correct. I was just making sure because someone made that mistake earlier. And this card's really, really good. This card is actually very, 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 very powerful for a couple major reasons. The first one is, like, if you turn something into a demon, she's like a 1/7. That's just very, very, very above rate. You turn like a 1/1 into a demon, that's a 1/7. It's very, very good. Baseline, that one's very good. Drawing 2 cards is usually completely nuts in a game like Marvel Snap, even if you have to sacrifice a card to do it. Like, even in decks that are not destroy, and to be clear, she's a staple destroy card almost entirely on the back of this, you are mostly fine doing that. It is a thing that will happen. Like, I will play a totally unrelated deck. Like, I'll be playing a Loki deck, and I will throw away a 1-drop into this because drawing my good cards is that important. And so that's another one of the major reasons why she's good. This one sucks. It's almost never played, but it can be good. This one is like, it's Forge, right? So like part of the reason she's a destroy staple is because destroy wants to pump their Deadpool up anyway. So you can use her to do that way too. Replacing your card's location is rare, to use, but when it is used, it's almost always used to win the game, like blowing up a limbo or a bar with no name or something like that. It's like just it's cool that it's free to have there, but it's not usually what you're looking for in the early turns. Adding a copy to your hand is another reason why she's a destroy staple. You play this and then you play a Venom, and your Venom eats a bunch of stuff, and you get the copy that has all the power on the Venom. Like, you remember Venom cloning vats, right? Like Carnage cloning vats. It's that. It's doing that, right? Okay. So destroy staple just off that, and off the other stuff we've talked about. But like, that's also good, like, for cloning your early scaling threats, right? Like, you play this into collector, and then you play a second collector, and then suddenly your Loki scales even higher with 2 collectors than it did with 1. Like, this is a cloning vats on a stick, and there are a lot of decks that can reasonably use that, even in a limited type of it's not, full cloning vats, just one time, but there's a lot of decks that can get a lot of value out of that. Sure. And then this one just makes her like a 1/4, but like, there are locations where, like, oh, you play her on Kamartage and she's a 1/8. It's like, oh, that's pretty good. You're just totally fine with that. So basically, like, yeah, she's unpredictable, but her baseline is just no, like, bad outcomes. High. Yeah, like, it's not like no bad outcomes. Like, there are situations where you're just like, oh my god, Nico, why did you give me, Scarlet Witch into Iron Fist? Like, that sucks, right? When you get that and you need the other ones. But like, the good outcomes are so high, and the mid outcomes are so fine, that it's like, yeah, this is just a very, very powerful card. And I think part of the reason bounce decks are in vogue right now is because playing her twice is like, oh my god, I used this to draw 2 cards, and then I turned something into a demon. That's like the best card in the game.
Yep, that sounds pretty good. I think maybe what hurt my analysis was just like thinking about this card on turns past turn 1. I was kind of underwhelmed by what I saw the impact being, and particularly on like turns 4 and 5, where maybe I would be playing towards a very specific thing, and this card just sort of dooms my chance to play towards that thing. But you take ceilings, or you take floors with massive ceilings, and having some of the use cases laid out, I can see the case coming together.
It's definitely a metagame right now that is sympathetic to what she does. It's a lot of decks that meet the conditions you laid out, and in a metagame where everyone is just playing like 2, 3, 4, 5, she'd be terrible. But that's just not how it is right now. And I think that does impact some of these. Like, cards come out, and if they come out at the right time, people's evaluations of them will be high for a little too long, I think.
Yep.
Because context really does define everything in Marvel Snap. I don't know that Nico is going to be good forever. That said, because she is such a like obvious banger in Destroy, she has like a home forever. She's not going to be like played in every deck forever. That's the anomaly. But because she's an obvious banger in Destroy, she's an obvious banger in Thanos, she's going to have homes forever, right? When she first came out, I was like, oh, this is the 7th Infinity Stone. And like, yeah, she definitely is. Like, drawing 2 cards in a Thanos deck, Jesus Christ. Like, seems
good.
It is definitely one of those things. That said, Thanos is currently like at a very significant nadir in terms of playability. But like, even so, like, just knowing like she will always have a home in Destroy. She will always have a home in your Thanos deck, no matter what. Even with this meta being very favorable to her having homes other places, those 2 are probably always going to be true.
I like how you call out initial perception sort of having outsized impacts.
Yeah.
We see it in my game, Flesh and Blood, all the time, where things that happen very early on in a card's or hero's existence often have a very long tail.
Yes.
And it is fascinating from a design perspective to watch those things sort of stick around past sort of the reality of the situation. So I'm happy to hear that extends to literally every game on the planet.
I'm going to get killed for this, but the card I think of when I think of this, it's not a card I planned on showing you, is Legion, who's a 5/7 that turns all the locations into the location that he is played on. And it's like, we all evaluated that as a bad card, but when it came out, it was actually like one of the best cards in the game, because there were so many decks that were incredibly adept at using turns 1 through 4 to put a ton of power on the board. And so like they'd scale up in those turns, and then their turn 5 would be like something sort either scamming the game with a Legion or getting rid of a bad location, reducing RNG, and because their decks were so consistent at producing that power early, reducing the RNG just basically was like a guarantee of a win. And so Legion is consistently evaluated as like one of the best cards in the game, when what it really is if you can afford to play a 5/7 in those metagames, it's one of the best cards in the game. But if you can't afford to play a 5/7, people are going to beat your ass and play way stronger stuff on turn 5, then suddenly he's very embarrassing. And so I think like I worry that Nico might have a like similar life cycle to Legion, where it's like when Legion is good is entirely dependent on, how strong your early turns are, how much they scale up, how much you can rely on them to win the game, and not so much the 7 power off of the Legion to win the game. And Nico is the same, where it's like if the best deck in the game is just playing a card on every turn of the game, Nico's not really going in there. Like this is one of the things I worry about with her. But I think with her, it's so clear that Destroy is going to be a deck for forever, that like her floor on purchasing is much higher, where it's just like, yeah, this is probably just going to be a card you're going to play as long as you even remotely like the archetypes, that she's guaranteed to go in forever.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense.
This is Sebastian Shaw. 3/4. When this card permanently gains power, gain 2 more power, wherever he is.
Okay, so this would be affected by things in deck as well.
Yeah, hand buff,
I don't know how much
deck
that still
buff,
happens.
and also on board buff.
Yeah, so I guess now we can come full circle to sort of like the first spot of analysis we did, where I was convinced that buffing power on an individual that scaled sort of in perpetuity could be really strong.
Well, I want to be clear though,
was a
like,
strong thing to do.
It can. We showed Werewolf, right? Like buffing power on that guy, it totally is. But like the question I'm having for you is like, is this Werewolf or is this Daken?
This feels more like Daken than Werewolf to me. I think because it doesn't have really any other influence over the game short of just making this big. And it does feel like Werewolf does a bit more than that. It is more unpredictable. This card is maybe a little bit more face up. I guess the most exciting thing to me about this card is the ability to just like juice it in hand, in deck, over and over and over, and sort of offer this progressive threat that your opponent has to be aware of on late turns of the game. So, I think back to I'm blanking on the card that was cost reduction for everything.
Sarah.
And Sarah. And so you're like Sarah control decks, and your late game was just, oh, I have all these options available to me.
Yeah.
And you have to track all these options. I could see Sebastian sort of setting up similar things in late turns of the game where, oh, you typically have to account for these things on a late turn. But because I've had Sebastian in my deck and it's caught these buffs, now I have access to a 1-drop that does something, a 2-drop that does something, and a 3, which is carrying way more power than you would expect it to. And that is more appealing to me than just like this number gets big, I play this on board, I keep making this number big. Like that's, I'm sure, very foilable by Shang-Chi. So I think Sebastian Shaw is probably better than the first card we looked at, but not by much, and still carries a lot of the same liabilities. And if it is better, I think it is more based on sort of surprise factor in the late game.
That is basically my read on the card as well. But this is actually a little bit cheating by me, because this is such a new card that I can't tell you one way or the other. I can just tell you that I agree with you. By the time this video comes out, we could both look stupid, or we could both look very smart. That is actually the last card that I have for you. Bryan, do you have anything you want to promote? You want to do your self-promo, promote your game, anything like that?
Yeah, come play Flesh and Blood, man. If you love TCGs, we are working really hard to put together a special classic TCG experience over on the Flesh and Blood side, particularly if you're somebody who loves that old school vibe of heading out to a big tournament, competing with millions of dollars on the line. We do offer $1.5 million as part of our pro play circuit next year. There's local qualifiers, regional qualifiers. We travel all over the world. We just had our world championships out in Barcelona. We're headed to LA in March for our next pro tour. We're going to head to Amsterdam for our pro tour in the middle of next year. So literally play the game, see the world type stuff going on with Flesh and Blood. And if you haven't checked it out. We also have like really great learn to play tutorials going up online, and the game is a blast. And it comes from folks who have a lot of those same sentiments you may be carrying around other presently played in-person card games that just are maybe not scratching that same itch they used to in the past. We're doing our best to scratch those itches for people and making a really great classic TCG experience.
I can say that while I appreciate the vibe you're cultivating, the number one thing that would get me to play your game is being able to play it without leaving my house. Me and my audience of Zoomers, like I don't know.
Look, man, we all want something different. We all want something different. Some of us want to stay in the house. Some of us want to leave the house. If you're somebody who's saying, you know what, I've been sitting in this same bedroom for 6 months now. Maybe I should get out and get a little fresh air, meet some people, interact with a great community. That's what we do over in our space.
Do you want to touch grass?
A little. Yeah. I carry grass with me to every event I go to, and I offer it to anyone who may need to touch it. So if you want to come, touch a little grass, have a little fun. I do think it is something special that's happening in the TCG space right now. And if it's not your thing, respect, man. We all have our own things. We all have our own passions. And I totally embrace folks who just want to live that Marvel Snap lifestyle and just keep grinding on their phones. More power to you.
I see, you talked about like, oh, I've been in this bedroom for 6 months. I should go outside. It's like, no, I've been in this bedroom for 6 months. I should stay here for 6 more months.
6 more months. Yeah, 6 more months of bedroom. Why not?
I'm like a groundhog who saw us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why mess with something that works?
Yeah. You don't mess with perfection. No. Thank you so much for coming on and evaluating these cards. I feel like this was a relatively serious episode, despite the fact, like, we're friends. We joke around sometimes, but like, this was a very evaluation and analysis focused episode. I'm really interested to see how it goes over. Anyone who made it this far in the video, let me know in the comments how you thought it went over. Thank you so much. Thanks, of course, to Bryan Gottlieb. I have been KM Best. I will see you in the next one.